My name is Eleanor Whitfield. Everyone calls me Nora. I'm 41 years old. And for the last 15 years, I've spent my working life sitting across kitchen tables from elderly people, asking them questions designed to answer one thing. Can this person still be trusted to run their own life? On a Tuesday afternoon in October, I sat in a beige conference room at Blue Ridge Manor, a nursing facility 15 minutes from the house I grew up in, holding a folder 2 inches thick, watching my father smile at a stranger with a clipboard who was about to tell a judge that my father's mind was gone. My brother sat across the table in a golf polo like this was a business lunch. 2 attorneys flanked him. A notary sat at the end with a stamp already uncapped. My father, Walter Whitfield, 74 years old, sharp enough that morning to correct me on the exact torque spec for a table saw blade, had no idea that the meeting he'd been told was just paperwork for the business, was actually the room where his own son planned to have him declared legally incompetent. By the time that meeting ended, one of those attorneys would be gone before his car left the parking lot, and my father would learn, in the space of about 11 minutes, exactly which one of his children he could actually trust with his name. Welcome back to Her Quiet Reckoning, where the quiet ones finally speak. If you've ever been the one who actually shows up, while somebody else gets the credit or the inheritance, this story is for you. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and stay to the end, because you're going to want to see what my husband brought in his briefcase. But none of that makes sense unless we go back 4 months. To the spring, my mother had been gone 2 years, and my brother started calling our father confused, a little too often for a man who still ran his own lumberyard 6 days a week. It was April, and my life looked, from any reasonable distance, completely stable. I live in Asheville, North Carolina, in a 100-year-old craftsman house with a porch swing that needs oiling, and a marriage that, 4 years in, still felt like the smartest decision I ever made. I work as a licensed clinical social worker specializing in geriatric care, specifically capacity and competency evaluations for a regional hospital system. When a family disagrees about whether Grandpa can still manage his own medications, or whether Grandma should still be signing checks, I'm often the person a court or a hospital calls in to actually look, carefully, methodically, without an agenda, and answer the question everyone else is too emotional to answer honestly. It is, in a strange way, the same skill my husband Daniel built his entire career on, though neither of us understood yet how directly those skills were about to collide with my own family. Daniel Osei and I met at a conference on elder law and clinical ethics, of all places. The kind of event where nobody expects romance to happen, which is exactly why it did. He's an attorney. What I told my family was that he does something with wills. That was technically true the way a lot of things I told my family were technically true. What I left out, because nobody ever asked a follow-up question, was that before he went into private practice, Daniel spent 9 years litigating guardianship and conservatorship abuse cases, the specific, ugly corner of the legal system where families fight over whether an aging parent still gets to make their own decisions, and who gets to make those decisions instead. He has stood in courtrooms and taken apart people who tried to declare a healthy parent incompetent in order to get their hands on a bank account. He just never expected to do it at his own father-in-law's kitchen table. My family lives 30 minutes east, in Hendersonville, in the same clapboard farmhouse I grew up in, on 11 acres that back up against what used to be, and still partly is, the Whitfield family lumber and hardware business. My father, Walter, built that business from 1 truck and a chainsaw in 1979 into something worth real money. The yard itself. The equipment. 40 acres of timberland he never developed because he liked the woods more than the money. And a portfolio his accountant had quietly built over 4 decades. All told, when everything was added up later, the estate came to just over $4.1 million. Nobody in my family talked about that number out loud. We didn't have to. Everyone already knew. My mother, Diane, died 2 years ago, quickly, of a stroke, with none of the long, slow decline that gives a family time to prepare for grief or for money. My father did what men of his generation do. He kept working. He hired a part-time housekeeper. He started dating, cautiously, a widow from his church named Carol Pruitt, and within a year they'd married. I liked Carol. She was quiet, a little anxious, clearly still adjusting to being the second wife in a house full of someone else's furniture, someone else's grief, and someone else's children who weren't entirely sure how to feel about her. And then there was my brother, Preston. 45. 4 years older than me. The kind of golden boy who peaked early and never fully recovered from the fact that the peak was behind him. He'd made real money once, flipping houses in the boom years, and then lost most of it in a condominium development outside Charlotte that stalled out during the rate hikes, leaving him leveraged against 2 properties, a business partner who was already suing him for breach of contract, and, I would later learn, a second mortgage he'd taken out without telling his own wife. Preston had always been checking in on Dad more than I had, geographically speaking, since he still lived in Hendersonville and I'd moved into Asheville for work. For years, that had simply been the arrangement, uncommented on. What changed starting that April was the tone. Preston began calling me with small updates that didn't quite match what I saw with my own eyes. "Dad's really struggling," he told me on the phone one evening. "He left the stove on again last week. Carol found it." I called Carol directly, gently, the way you learn to when you don't want to spook a source. She hesitated, and then admitted she wasn't sure that had actually happened. She thought Preston might have heard it from someone else and gotten details confused. When I visited that weekend, my father was, by every clinical measure I actually know how to apply, entirely himself. He balanced his own checkbook in front of me without missing a decimal. He remembered every grandchild's birthday, every employee's name at the yard, the exact day 41 years ago he bought his first flatbed truck. He was, if anything, sharper than most 60-year-olds I evaluate for a living. But I noticed something else that weekend, something small enough that I almost let it go. A man I didn't recognize was pulling out of my father's driveway just as I arrived, in a sedan with an out-of-state plate. When I asked Dad who that was, he said easily, "Oh, just a doctor friend of Preston's checking in on me. Nice fella." He couldn't remember the doctor's name. That detail sat in the back of my mind the entire drive home, the way a single anomalous data point sits in the back of your mind on any evaluation. One inconsistency doesn't make a pattern, but it's where every pattern starts. By early May, the calls from Preston had a rhythm to them, and the rhythm itself was the tell. He'd call me not to ask for help, but to leave a record, a small, dated deposit of concern, phrased just carefully enough that if you played it back later, it would sound like a worried son, not a man building a case. "Someone needs to think seriously about whether Dad should still be running the yard alone," he said one night. "I love him, Nora, but we both see it." I did not, in fact, see it. But I started, out of professional habit as much as suspicion, keeping my own notes. Dates, what Preston said, what I actually observed. It's the same discipline I use at work. If you don't write it down in real time, your memory will eventually reshape itself to match whichever story got repeated most often. And repetition, in families, is its own kind of evidence laundering. My Aunt Cheryl, my mother's sister, called me the following week with a version of events that had clearly traveled through several mouths before it reached mine. "Preston says your father wandered off the property last month. They found him near the county road, confused, didn't know what day it was." I asked her where she'd heard this. "Preston told your cousin, who told me." I called my father that same afternoon and asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether he remembered walking near the county road recently. He laughed and told me he'd walked out to check on a downed fence line after a storm, same as he'd done every year of his life, and that it had taken him exactly the amount of time it takes a 74-year-old man to walk a quarter mile and back. There was no confusion. There was no wandering. There was a fence. I want to be honest about something here, because it's the part of this story I've had to sit with the longest. I am trained professionally to notice exactly this kind of narrative drift. A true, boring event, retold 3 times, each time gaining a little more drama, a little more evidence of decline, until by the 4th telling it sounds like something out of a competency hearing. I recognized the pattern immediately because I diagnosed that pattern for a living in other families, and I still, for weeks, told myself my own brother wouldn't do that on purpose. It was Carol, again, who handed me the piece that made denial impossible. She mentioned, almost in passing while we unloaded groceries, that Preston had been bringing his doctor friend by more regularly, every couple of weeks now, and that the visits had started to feel less like friendly check-ins and more like something being documented. "He asks your dad odd questions," she said, "like tests. What year is it? Who's the president? Can he name the last 5 prime ministers, whatever that means? My father is an American who has never once, in 74 years, needed to know a foreign head of government. That detail told me the doctor wasn't evaluating my father's cognition. He was filling out a form that had been written somewhere else, for somebody else, and simply hadn't been localized to fit a real person. I did what I do at work when a story stops adding up. I started a file. I found out about the petition almost by accident, which is its own kind of quiet betrayal. That the first official notice of a plan to take away my father's legal right to make his own decisions did not come from my brother at all. It came from a clerk. I was at the Henderson County Courthouse on an unrelated matter for my job, waiting on a records request for an actual client, when the clerk, recognizing my name from a filing she was pulling for someone else that same morning, mentioned it without thinking twice. "Oh, are you here about the Whitfield Guardianship Petition too?" I remember standing very still in that hallway. The way you stand still right before an X-ray comes back different than you expected. I requested the file. What I read over the next hour, sitting on a hard bench outside courtroom 3, rearranged everything I thought I understood about my own family. Preston had filed a petition for guardianship and conservatorship over our father, citing progressive cognitive decline, and requesting to be named sole guardian of both his person and his estate. Attached to the petition was a capacity evaluation from a physician named Dr. Aldous Renner, licensed not in North Carolina but in a neighboring state, whose report described a man who bore only a passing resemblance to my father, confused about time and place, unable to manage basic finances, a fall risk, unsafe living alone. I ran Dr. Renner's name the way I run any professional credential I'm handed at work. Because in my field you learn early that a diploma on a wall means nothing until you verify it yourself. His license was listed as active but under a pending board review, the details sealed. His practice address was a UPS store mailbox in a strip mall 2 states away. There was no record of him holding privileges at any hospital. No record of a standard neuropsychological battery. No record of an in-person visit lasting longer than the 20 minutes Carol had already described to me. And there, buried on page 4 of the petition, was the detail that turned my stomach in a way the rest of it hadn't quite managed. Preston's filing asked the court to simultaneously suspend the medical power of attorney my mother had set up years earlier, naming me, not him, as the one authorized to make Dad's healthcare decisions if he ever couldn't make them himself. My mother had made that choice deliberately, years before she died, because she trusted my judgment on exactly this kind of question. Preston's petition would erase that decision entirely and replace it with himself, as sole authority over both our father's body and our father's $4.1 million estate. I sat on that courthouse bench for a long time before I could make my hands stop, shaking enough to photograph every page. That night, I opened a folder on my laptop and named it the way I name every case file I've ever opened professionally, plainly, without drama, because drama is for people who haven't yet learned that boring. Organized paperwork is the only thing that actually wins. I called it the Walter file. Into it went the petition, Dr. Renner's licensing record, every text message from Preston describing incidents that hadn't happened the way he described them, my own contemporaneous notes on every visit with my father going back to March, and, because I had spent that afternoon in a records office anyway, a request for my father's actual medical records, his real primary care physician, his real blood work, his real cognitive screening from his last annual physical, all of which, it turned out, showed a man scoring comfortably within normal range for his age. Word travels strangely in families. Once one member starts asking questions the rest have silently agreed not to ask. I don't know exactly how Preston learned I'd found the petition before he was ready to present it to me himself, but within a week the family group chat, which had been mostly recipe links and grandchildren photos for years, turned into something closer to a tribunal. My cousin texted first. "Why are you fighting Preston on this? He's just trying to protect Dad." Aunt Cheryl followed with a call in which she used the word difficult to describe me 4 separate times in under 6 minutes. Even Carol, caught in the middle of a marriage where she was clearly more afraid of Preston's temper than she'd ever admitted to me, sent one careful coded text. "I don't know everything. Please be careful." Preston himself showed up at my office on a Thursday afternoon, which he had never once done in the 4 years I'd worked there. He stood in my doorway in a blazer he doesn't normally wear to visit family, and he opened disarmingly, with my own professional title. "You evaluate people like this for a living. Nora, you of all people should understand what I'm seeing. Dad's not what he used to be. You just don't want to see it because you don't want the responsibility." It was, I'll admit, a well-aimed sentence. It borrowed my own authority and pointed it back at me. The way Chase Merritt, in another family's story, once borrowed a fraternity brother's law license to make a shakedown look official. I told Preston, in the same voice I use with families who bring me a diagnosis they got off the internet, that I had in fact reviewed our father's actual medical records, and that they showed no cognitive impairment consistent with his petition. Preston's face did something small and involuntary, the flicker of a man recalculating whether his audience had already seen the whole board. That same week, I did to my own brother exactly what I do professionally to any party in a dispute whose story doesn't match the paperwork. I looked at his finances. Public records made most of it easy. A foreclosure notice on an investment property outside Charlotte. A breach of contract lawsuit from a former development partner, seeking just under $600,000. A second mortgage on his own home, taken out 8 months earlier, that his wife's name did not appear on. And a closing date, buried in an unrelated county land record, on 40 acres of undeveloped Whitfield timberland, the same acreage my father had refused to sell to a regional developer for over a decade, showing a signed letter of intent contingent on, in the developer's own words, confirmation of clear authority to convey. Preston did not need our father declared incompetent out of concern. He needed our father declared incompetent so that he, as sole guardian of the estate, could sign away land my father had spent 40 years refusing to sell, in time to cover debts that were about to swallow him whole. I brought all of it home and laid it across our dining table the way I imagine a surgeon lays out instruments before they've decided exactly what they're about to operate on. Daniel came in from a run, saw the spread, and did the thing that, 4 years into our marriage, I still fall a little bit more in love with him for every single time. He didn't say anything for 10 minutes. He read every page in order, and then he looked up and asked the only question that actually mattered. "Does your family know what I used to do before I went into private practice?" They didn't. In 4 years of holidays, not one Whitfield had ever asked my husband a real question about his work, beyond a polite, forgettable nod. Here is what one question would have gotten them. Before opening his own practice, Daniel Osei spent 9 years representing elderly clients and their families in guardianship abuse litigation. Cases exactly like this one, except the men he'd gone up against usually had better lawyers and worse consciences. My family had spent 4 years treating one of the most experienced guardianship litigators on the eastern seaboard like a quiet accountant who did something with wills. Before I let this become what it was clearly becoming. I tried once to reach my brother the way I would want someone to reach me if I were the one about to make the worst mistake of my life. I asked Preston to meet me alone, at a diner halfway between our two towns, and I brought exactly one document, the mildest one in the file. Not the finances, not the foreclosure, not the lawsuit, just Dr. Renner's public licensing record, showing the pending board review, the out-of-state address, the missing hospital privileges. I slid it across the table the way you'd hand someone a jacket in the cold, and I told him I wasn't accusing him of anything yet. I was asking him to look at who he'd actually hired to evaluate our father. Preston looked at it for perhaps 4 seconds. Then he looked at me, and something closed behind his eyes, quick and final, like a storm shutter dropping at midnight. "You've been investigating me," he said, and his voice climbed the way it used to when we were kids, and he'd been caught at something and needed the fastest possible exit from blame. "Dad's declining and you're worried about a doctor's zip code? You've always thought you were the only competent one in this family, Nora. This proves it," I told him, as evenly as I could manage, that it was one public document, that anyone could look it up in 5 minutes, that I had, in fact, looked it up in 5 minutes. And that's when my brother leaned back, crossed his arms, and said the part of the quiet part that told me everything I needed to know about how far he was prepared to go. Everyone bends the rules a little when a family needs protecting. At least I'm doing something instead of just watching him slip. He believed, or had talked himself into believing, that the ends justified whatever the paperwork needed to say. He stood, dropped a 10 on the table for coffee he hadn't touched, and told me on his way out that he hoped I'd come around before this got harder for everyone. Then, he left me sitting there with a receipt and the absolute certainty that gentleness had already run its course. There's a moment in my work when a family member stops being a person I'm worried about and becomes a case. I have to build, methodically, the way you'd build any file you might need to defend in front of a judge who has never met the people involved and doesn't care about anyone's feelings, only the facts on the page. That night, I did that to my own brother. I bought a plain accordion folder the next morning and labeled the tab in block letters, the Walter file. Into it went, in order, the Guardianship Petition itself, Dr. Renner's licensing record, a notarized letter I requested from my father's actual, long-standing primary care physician, describing his real cognitive baseline in plain clinical language, my father's most recent full physical, including a standardized cognitive screening score comfortably within the normal range for his age, copies of every text message from Preston describing incidents that either hadn't happened or hadn't happened the way he described them, cross-referenced against dates I could independently verify. The county land record showing the letter of intent on the timberland, the foreclosure notice, the breach of contract suit. Daniel added his own section without being asked, a memo, written in the plain, devastating language of a man who has done this exact thing to other families' Prestons in open court, listing every procedural defect in the petition itself. No independent court-appointed evaluator, no required in-person examination meeting the state's statutory minimum, a physician whose license was under active review at the time the report was filed. He slid it into the back of the folder the way you'd load a second weapon, quietly, without commentary, and said only, just in case we need it. I asked him if he thought we would. I think, he said, your brother has already decided he's out of better options. The call came from Preston on a Sunday evening, and his voice had exactly the warmth I'd learned by then to be afraid of. He said Dad wanted the family together to sort out some paperwork for the business. Casual, no big deal. Just everyone at the yard's back office on Wednesday afternoon. He didn't mention lawyers. He didn't mention a doctor. He didn't need to, because by then I already understood the shape of what was coming, the way you understand a storm system from 3 states away, days before the rain actually reaches you, I told Daniel, and he didn't tell me not to go. He asked me what I wanted to do, and I heard myself say the truest sentence I'd said in months. I know exactly what this might be, and I'm still going, because if there's any chance at all this is actually just paperwork, I want to be standing there when it isn't a fight anymore. We spent the 2 days before that meeting the way you prepare for a hearing, because that is, in every way that mattered, exactly what it was. I made 3 complete copies of the Walter file at a print shop in town, tabbed and bound, because documents you might have to hand across a table should never exist in only 1 copy. Daniel called the state medical board directly and confirmed on the record that Dr. Renner's license review had, in fact, been opened specifically over improper remote evaluations submitted in contested guardianship cases in 2 other states. I drove out to my father's own doctor's office and picked up a certified, signed copy of his real cognitive assessment, the kind of boring, official paper that wins these fights every single time. Wednesday morning, before we left, I stood at our kitchen table with my hand flat on the folder, and I want to mark this moment honestly, because it's the quiet hinge this whole story turns on. Once you've built a file on your own brother, thick enough to hold up in front of a judge, something in you changes permanently, whether or not you ever have to open it. I already knew, standing in my own kitchen, that whatever happened that afternoon, the sister who used to give Preston the benefit of the doubt automatically, every time without asking for evidence first, she wasn't coming back from this. I felt that the way you feel a season change before you've checked a single forecast. Daniel found me standing there and didn't say anything. He just picked the folder up off the table and carried it to the car himself. The back office at Whitfield Lumber and Hardware smells the way it's smelled my entire life. Cut pine, engine oil, my father's coffee going cold in the same chipped blue mug he's used since before I was born. When we walked in, that smell was still there, but the room around it had been rearranged into something I didn't recognize. A folding table had been set up in the middle of the office, and around it sat my brother. An attorney I didn't know, introduced simply as Preston's counsel, A man with a clipboard I now recognize from the licensing file as Dr. Aldous Renner himself, and a notary already seated at the end with her stamp uncapped and ready. My father sat at the head of that table in his work boots, utterly at ease, believing this was about business, a permit renewal, an equipment loan, something ordinary. Carol sat beside him, her hands folded too tightly in her lap, not meeting my eyes when I came in. At my place at the table sat a document nearly as thick as a phone book, small yellow tabs marking every page where a signature was expected. Beneath it, half visible, was a summary sheet titled Guardian and Conservator Petition, Consent and Waiver of Objection, with my own name printed at the top, ready for my signature waiving any objection to Preston's guardianship. Preston's attorney opened the meeting with a tone designed to make surrender sound like a formality. He explained in soft procedural language that given recent concerns about Mr. Whitfield's cognitive status, the family was here to finalize a voluntary transition of decision-making authority to Preston in everyone's best interest, especially Walter's. Dr. Renner nodded along at intervals, murmuring small clinical-sounding phrases that meant nothing at all. My father, hearing his own name discussed in the third person as though he weren't sitting 3 feet away, finally frowned and said, "Somebody want to tell me what this actually is?" Nobody answered him directly. Preston answered instead, and his voice had exactly the practiced gentleness of a man who has rehearsed this exact sentence in a mirror. "Dad, we just want to make sure you're protected. That's all this is." I asked my questions the way I asked them at work, one at a time, in the plainest possible language, because vague, official-sounding paperwork depends entirely on nobody asking a plain question out loud. Who performed the cognitive evaluation attached to this petition, and where? Dr. Renner answered that he had conducted a remote clinical interview, which, I pointed out, is not the in-person standardized assessment the petition itself claims it is. What safeguards exist if the guardian himself has an undisclosed financial interest in the estate being managed? Preston's attorney called that question irrelevant to today's proceeding, which is, in my experience, exactly what a relevant question sounds like to a person who doesn't have an answer for it. And then my brother, watching the room start to slip away from the script he'd paid for, did what cornered people in these situations almost always eventually do. He stopped being smooth. "Nora, just sign the waiver," he said, and his voice had an edge now, thin and sharp underneath the family meeting softness. "You don't want this getting ugly. I know what you found on my finances. I know you've been digging. Sign it, or I go to the state board myself and tell them you've been mismanaging Dad's medical decisions this whole time. Conflict of interest, remember, since you hold the healthcare power of attorney." Let's see whose story they believe. The room went very still. Even Dr. Renner blinked. My father's frown deepened into something closer to alarm, though I don't think even then he fully understood what his own son had just threatened to do to me. I set my pen down, squared it against the folder in front of me, and said, "Before anyone signs anything, I'd like you to meet my husband." Daniel set his coffee cup down with the small, precise click of a man who has been waiting patiently for the meeting to finally reach his agenda item. He didn't raise his voice. He reached into the briefcase at his feet, and while he did, he introduced himself to my family, properly, for the first time in 4 years. Daniel Osei. For 9 years, I represented families in contested guardianship and conservatorship litigation, including a number of cases involving remote evaluations submitted by physicians whose licenses were under active board review at the time the evaluation was performed. These days, I have my own practice. I've sat across tables exactly like this 1 more times than I can count. Usually the coffee's better. I watched that sentence move around the room like weather. Preston's attorney's expression rearranged itself in real time. The look of a man quickly recalculating an exit strategy. Dr. Renner, who had been performing careful boredom over his clipboard, went completely, visibly still. The stillness of a man who has just recognized a predator in a room he thought was safe. Daniel slid the first document across the table and placed it gently in front of my father. "Walter, before anyone signs anything today, you should see this. It's your own physician's certified evaluation from 6 weeks ago. Standard cognitive screening. Your score is well within the normal range for your age. There is no clinical basis anywhere in your actual medical record for the claims in this petition. Then he placed a second document in the center of the table, where the coffee pot should have gone. This is the public licensing record for the physician who prepared the report attached to Preston's petition. His license is currently under review specifically for improper remote evaluations submitted in contested guardianship filings in 2 other states. He has never met Walter Whitfield in a properly documented in-person clinical setting. He let that sit for exactly 1 breath before the third document went down. And this is a county land record showing a signed letter of intent on 40 acres of Whitfield family timberland, contingent on confirmation of, and I'm quoting the developer's own language here, clear authority to convey, alongside a foreclosure notice and a pending $600,000 breach of contract judgment against Preston personally. I'd invite anyone at this table to explain what legitimate concern for Walter's welfare requires a closing date of clear authority to convey timed almost exactly to the guardianship hearing date on this petition. The paper went hand to hand around that folding table like a collection plate nobody wanted to touch. My father read the land record twice, his jaw working the way it does when he's holding something back that he doesn't yet trust himself to say out loud. Carol had stopped pretending to read anything at all. She was simply staring at Preston. Preston started a sentence. I can explain the land thing. That's completely separate. And discovered, mid-word, that no one at that table, not even his own attorney, was going to lay any track in front of that particular train. Daniel closed with the quietest, most surgical line of the entire afternoon. Threatening a licensed clinician with a false board complaint in order to obtain a signature under duress is, in this state, its own separate problem, entirely apart from everything else on this table. I'm going to assume that was a man under a great deal of financial pressure saying something he already regrets. We're going to leave it in this room. Once. Preston's attorney gathered his files faster than he'd laid them out, muttering something about reviewing the underlying medical documentation that fooled absolutely no one, and was out the door with Dr. Renner 2 steps behind him before the screen door had finished swinging shut. Preston called after them, "Wait, we can still... This is just context," to a parking lot that had already stopped listening. And then it was just the 4 of us, and a cold pot of coffee, and my father, sitting at the head of a table that 10 minutes earlier had nearly cost him his own name. He looked at Preston for a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was quieter and steadier than I expected. The voice he used to use on a job site when something had gone seriously wrong and yelling wasn't going to fix it. "You were going to have me declared unfit," he said. "Not a question. So you could sell my woods to cover your own debts." Preston didn't answer. Carol finally spoke, quietly, her hands still folded too tightly in her lap. "He told me it was just to protect you from bad decisions, Walter. I should have asked more questions. I'm sorry." My father turned to me, and I watched something in his face settle, the way water settles once it's finally found the actual bottom of a glass. "You knew about this for weeks," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was closer to grief. "I didn't want to tell you until I could show you, not just tell you," I said. "I wanted you to see the whole thing at once. Not a piece I couldn't back up yet. Here's what I did next. And I want you to know my hands were steady, because they were, even though it cost more than I expected it to." I took the folder, the Walter file, my own name still on the tab, and I slid it across the table until it touched my father's hand, not Preston's. "It's all in here, Dad. Every page. It's yours now." Then I turned to my brother, and I gave him the only thing I had left to give. Not the license complaint Daniel could have filed within the hour, not the fraud referral that would have been well within our rights. Just the truth, in the plainest words I had. I've spent my whole career deciding whether people are still capable of running their own lives, Preston. I have never once seen a case built this carefully by someone who actually believed the person needed protecting. You didn't need Dad declared incompetent. You needed him unable to say no. Outside, in the gravel lot, Daniel had his phone out, thumb already moving toward the number for the state medical board's after-hours reporting line. We had by that point every legal tool available to end Preston's finances, his standing with his own business partners, possibly even his marriage. In a single afternoon of phone calls, I put my hand over the screen. "No complaint tonight," I said. "Not yet." He looked at me for a second, then put the phone away without argument. Then what are we doing? Making sure Dad's paperwork is airtight, I said. The rest can wait until we're not making decisions out of anger. We didn't drive away feeling triumphant. You don't, in situations like that. You drive away feeling like you've just watched a structural beam in your own family finally give way. And you're grateful, mostly, that nobody was standing under it when it fell. In the weeks that followed, Preston's petition was formally withdrawn, quietly, without a hearing. Once his attorney reviewed exactly what Daniel had assembled and recognized how badly it would go in front of an actual judge, my father, with his own longtime attorney present this time, and a properly conducted independent evaluation on record purely to protect himself going forward, updated his estate plan on his own terms. Not because anyone forced him to, but because the whole ordeal had taught him, at 74, that clarity is its own kind of insurance. Preston's development deal on the timberland collapsed within 2 months, once the letter of intent's contingency could no longer be met. I didn't gloat about it, and I want to be honest that I wanted to. His foreclosure went through anyway. His marriage, from what Carol has quietly told me since, is strained but intact. He has not spoken to me since that afternoon in the back office, and I've made my peace, mostly, with the idea that he may not for a long time, if ever. Carol, oddly, is the one who reached out first, on a Tuesday afternoon in December, with a text that said only, "I should have said something sooner. Thank you for not letting it happen." I wrote back exactly what I meant. I'm glad you're here now. No further explanation required. No invoice attached. My father, for his part, did something small that meant more to me than almost anything else in this entire story. 2 weeks after that meeting, without telling anyone in advance, he drove himself to his own longtime attorney's office, sat down alone and updated his will in his own handwriting, on his own schedule, naming his own choices without a single person standing over his shoulder telling him what those choices should be. When he told me about it afterward, over coffee at his kitchen table, he said, "First time in 2 years I've made a decision about my own life without somebody else already having an opinion ready. Felt good, Nora. Felt like mine." I spend my professional life asking one deceptively simple question. Is this person still capable of deciding things for themselves? What this spring taught me is that the question isn't really about memory or age or a score on a screening test. It's about who benefits from the answer. Guardianship exists to protect people who genuinely can't protect themselves anymore. It is not supposed to be a tool for someone who simply doesn't want to ask permission before they take what isn't theirs yet. My brother didn't need my father declared incompetent because he believed it. He needed it because a competent man would have said no to selling his own woods. And Preston had run out of other ways to make that no disappear. If you've ever watched someone try to rewrite a parent's mind on paper because the parent's actual mind kept getting in the way of what they wanted, I hope this reaches you. You are allowed to ask the plain question out loud, even in a room full of people who'd rather you didn't. You are allowed to build the file, and you are allowed, when it's finally laid out on the table in front of everyone, to hand it to the person it actually belongs to. That's my story. 1 petition, 1 folder, and a husband who only needed 3 documents and 1 very quiet sentence. If this reached you, share it with someone who's still being told they're the difficult one for simply telling the truth. Drop your own story in the comments. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.